Great. Thank you. And Dominique, thanks for your kind words in the chat already. I haven't even said one word, and I'm grateful for your support here. So hopefully this will live up to your enthusiasm, Dominique. So as Dominique has already shown, you can leave comments in the chat. You're happy to, if you want to raise questions or comments during it, I'm happy to address it during our time together here today. But let me just start out by saying the following. Today, we write messages by tapping on glass screens. Sometimes we even talk to glass screens. But for thousands of years, quill pens were the norm. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, all of these were written with quills that were torn from live geese's bodies. In fact, Thomas Jefferson was such a prolific writer that he even bred geese at Monticello for the primary purpose of having a steady stream of quills with which he could write. Until the 19th century, the literate world required vast numbers of geese, all of whom were subjected to live plucking so violent and so inhumane that today's anti-cruelty laws would simply prohibit it. But it was not humane sentiment. It wasn't sustainability concerns that spared geese from such an undesirable fate. Rather, the invention of the metal fountain pen was indeed both good for the goose and good for the gander. With the newfound ability to write sentences uninterrupted by the need to dip a quill into an inkwell, no need to sharpen the quill tip repeatedly, metal fountain pens didn't just mimic quills. They were so superior that they quickly rendered the quill pen a relic of an archaic past. Today, we face yet another opportunity to use new technology to render a distasteful practice obsolete. But this time, the stakes are far, far higher. You see, today we face yet another problem with how we raise geese, but really the problem is not just geese. The problem today is much, much bigger. The problem today is that we are raising billions of geese, chickens, turkeys, pigs, cows, fishes, and other animals who we frankly really like to eat. And this is a major problem, of course, for those animals, but also for us and for the rest of the planet. You see, the planet is just not getting any bigger. Humanity's footprint on the planet is getting a lot bigger, but the planet itself is not getting any bigger. And one of the primary ways that we leave that footprint is through our food print, principally in the amount of meat that we eat. It is no longer a secret that raising and slaughtering billions of animals for food uses vast amounts of land, water, energy, greenhouse gases, and more, especially when compared to just eating plants. Raising animals for food is the #1 contributor to deforestation, wildlife extinction, and more. As just one example to put this into perspective, the animal agriculture industry creates more greenhouse gas emissions than the entirety of the transportation sector all combined. Let that sink in for a minute. Raising animals for food contributes more to climate change than all cars, all boats, all planes, all trains, and all trucks, again, all combined. Now, despite the fact that we all know it would be better for the planet and for our health to eat fewer animals and enjoy a more plant-based diet, meat demand continues to go up, not down. It's not only that we're adding more humans to the planet who are creating that increased demand, although that is part of the issue. It is also that on a per person basis, we are eating more meat than ever before in human history. Now, it would be fantastic if we all wanted to enjoy more lentil soup, rice and bean burritos, hummus wraps. Those are great foods, don't get me wrong. Many of us purport to love them. I do love them. I eat them all the time. But it would also be nice if we wanted to walk and bike more. Yet people seem to really like driving, which is why we need to make cars that don't rely on fossil fuels. Similarly, people seem to really want to eat meat, which is why we need to recreate the meat without animals. And just in the same way that metal fountain pens allowed us to write, but in a far more efficient way than how we had written for millennia prior, the task before humanity today must be to find ways to continue to enjoy the experience of meat, but in a far more efficient way, meaning without having to raise and kill so many animals. Well, good news. Just as there are many ways to create energy without fossil fuels, like wind, solar, geothermal, nuclear, and more, there are many ways to create meat experiences without animals. Already, companies are turning plants like soybeans and peas and wheat into foods that resemble animal meat, but with a dramatically lower footprint on the planet. These plant-based meats aren't fake meat any more than a metal fountain pen is a fake quill. They are just different kinds of more efficient, more sustainable meat experiences. And as cool as plant-based meats are, and they are really cool, there are certain limitations on using plants to mimic animal meat. Plants are just really far away from animals on the tree of life. So you need to do a lot to them to make them look and taste like animals. As a result, some companies aren't using plants at all. They're using animal cells. But let's just think about what it takes, why you would do that, right? If you think about plant-based meat, something, let's say, like an Impossible or a Beyond Burger, the way they make those products is basically, let's say the Beyond Burger as an example, you grow a field of peas, you harvest a field of peas, you mill it into a flour, and that pea flour is pretty low in protein, maybe 20% on a dry weight basis. And at that point, you've got this protein poor powder. And so you have to strip out the fiber, you strip out the fat, and you concentrate it down into a pea protein powder that is something like what an athlete might take as a supplement. After that, you now have a protein-rich powder, but it's not texturized like animal-based meat. As a result, you have to subject it to something that's known as twin screw extrusion, which is basically a fancy way of saying a lot of pressure and a lot of heat. That changes the molecular structure of the protein, so it goes from being round and globular like a plant protein to stringy like an animal protein. Then you get your hero ingredient of texturized pea protein, which then gets added to maybe 15 or so other ingredients, and you get something like a Beyond Burger. Now, don't get me wrong, Beyond Burgers are good. If you go to, let's say, a fast food restaurant and your choice is to get a conventional slaughter-based burger or a Beyond Burger, it's better for the planet and better for you to get the Beyond Burger. But there were a lot of processes that had to go into creating that Beyond Burger. You're not eating really peas, you're eating a small fraction of the pea that's been processed in such a way to make it taste more like animal meat with a bunch of other ingredients. Now, again, these products are better than conventional slaughter-based meat. They have no cholesterol, less saturated fat, more fiber. Like there's no doubt that while these are not as healthy, let's say, as eating a kale salad or a quinoa salad, there's no doubt that they are better than conventional slaughter-based meat. But you have to do a lot to plants to make them look and taste like animals. And so, as I alluded to earlier, you have some companies that are now, instead of using organisms from the plant kingdom, like peas, instead of just growing animal cells. This is called cultivated meat or sometimes clean meat. And this is real, actual animal meat. It's not a substitute or an alternative to meat. It's real, actual animal meat that's grown without having to raise and slaughter animals. And while I am enthusiastic about this technology, in fact, I wrote a book about this technology. It's called Clean Meat: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. And there's a new paperback edition that actually just came out today with Simon & Schuster. You can go online and order it anywhere books are sold, from Amazon and anywhere else. But the book's website is cleanmeat.com. Again, check it out at cleanmeat.com. Now, as enthusiastic as I am, though, about the possibility for a future industry where we can grow meat without animals, the reality is that growing meat without animals is a very promising technology, but it is still many years away from becoming available at fast food stores and big box grocery chains, which is, of course, what's needed to start making a dent in the problem that we're trying to solve, since that's where most food is sold, at fast food restaurants and Walmart and Costco and Safeway and so on. And it's going to be many years before meat grown from animal cells is at a scale where it can compete in those locations. So while that may be something for the future, it's not something for today, in the sense that it's not able to scale in the very near term. However, there is a third way. Now, remember, we talked about the plant kingdom, like growing peas to turn them into meat. And we talked about the animal kingdom, like using animal cells. Well, there is a third way. There is another kingdom altogether that's not plant and that's not animal. And of course, I am talking about the F word. Fungi, of course. Now, not any kind of fungi, though. I'm talking here not about mushrooms, but I'm talking about microscopic fungi, often referred to as mycelium, or the root-like filaments of fungi that essentially blanket the earth. And so if you think about the kingdom of fungi, yes, we oftentimes think about mushrooms as being synonymous with fungi, but that is not really true. Only about 10% of fungi species even produce mushrooms at all. 90% of fungi species never produce any mushrooms. They're things like yeasts or filamentous fungi and others that are not mushrooms. And mushrooms are great. Don't get me wrong, I love mushrooms. I'd be thrilled to eat mushrooms every day. In fact, I try to. But mushrooms don't have much protein. Sure, some of them may have a kind of animal meat-like texture, but they don't have much protein. And most people who are eating meat, of course, they're doing it because they like the taste and texture and so on, but they also want that protein from the meat. Mushrooms might get you part of the way there with a somewhat meat-like texture, but they're not going to get you there on the protein. And while mushrooms won't do that, the good news is that mycelium can. Mycelium, again, the root-like structure of fungi, oftentimes not only has a very meat-like texture, but is packed with protein. So if you think about grade school biology, you remember there was the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and if you were taught properly, you learned that there's this entirely other kingdom of life, the fantastic world of fungi. Now, interestingly enough, if you have animals here and plants here, right, this on the tree of life, fungi are not in the middle. They are way closer to animals, evolutionarily speaking. So just as an example, animals breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2. We know plants do the opposite, right? They breathe in CO2 and they breathe out oxygen. Well, fungi are so much similar to animals than to plants that, like us, they breathe in oxygen, and they breathe out CO2. Similarly, we all know that plants just put themselves out in the sun and they photosynthesize in order to gain energy, whereas, of course, animals don't do that. Animals have to go out, find food, and digest it. And guess what? Fungi are so much more similar to animals that is what they also do. They go out, they find food, and they digest it. Now, they do it in a different method than what animals do, but still, they're not photosynthesizing. They are finding nutrients in the environment that they then go and consume. So, interestingly enough, again, fungi and animals are way closer to one another, evolutionarily speaking, than either is to plants. So it shouldn't be surprising then that there are many species of fungi whose flesh, so to speak, is far more meat-like than plants typically are. And there are a whole host of fungi whose mycelium is not only very meat-like in its texture, but is also packed with protein, iron, zinc, and other nutrients that are typically associated not with plants, but with animal-based meat. In other words, we can use fungi to grow foods that in their natural whole food state are already meat textured and packed with protein without needing to slaughter animals or overly processed plants. And the result is frankly amazing. At my startup, the Better Meat Co., which is a company that was started 6 years ago, we grow mycelium, or what we call mycoprotein, into alternative steaks, bacon, sausage, chicken breasts, and these are dramatically more meat-like in the experience than those from plant-based sources. And again, they are all natural whole food nutrition. In fact, it is so good for you that the mycoprotein that we grow at the Better Meat Co. has, straight out of the fermenter, more protein than eggs, and it's a complete protein, meaning all the essential amino acids. It's got more iron than beef, more zinc than beef, more potassium than bananas, more fiber than oats, and it naturally contains vitamin B12, which is typically lacking in plant-based foods. In other words, you get all of the nutrition from meat that you want, protein, iron, zinc, and so on, but you don't get the things from meat that you don't want. Cholesterol, saturated fat, excess calories, environmental degradation, animal cruelty, and more. This is really like a superfood because straight out of the fermenter, you get that process that creates that really meat-like product cost effectively with a superior nutritional profile. It's almost too good to be true, but it is true, and we make it all the time right here in Sacramento, where I am sitting in our mycoprotein fermentation facility. It looks, when you walk into it, like a craft brewery, which is kind of what it is, but we are not brewing alcohols, we are brewing proteins. And we do it, again, in an all-natural way that takes very little time and is extremely efficient. Think about the fact that raising a cow for food, you have to feed that cow for well over a year before you get a steak. You have to feed a pig for about half of a year before you get a pork chop. You have to feed a chicken for about 40 days before you get nuggets. In our case, our little microscopic fungi are harvested after literally less than one single day. Less than one single day from the time we inoculate our fermenter to the time that we harvest our fermenter, we get delicious, succulent, nutritious mycoprotein that we then sell on a B2B basis or a business to business basis to other food companies so that they can make better meat. In other words, fungi fermentation can allow us to keep enjoying the experience of meat consumption, but by using vastly less land, less water, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and more. And it is, of course, also far more humane to animals. By harnessing the power of microbial fungi fermentation like we do at the Better Meat Co., we can rapidly and cost-effectively mass produce such alt meat in stainless steel tanks that, again, really resemble more like a craft brewery. And we are able to do this in a way that is way more efficient than raising animals. In fact, I would go so far as to say this is among the most efficient ways to produce protein on a planet that is getting increasingly more and more crowded by the day. We currently have 8 billion of us walking around the planet today. 8 billion of us. And meat demand, again, is going up, not down. It's going up, yes, in most of the developed world, but it's also going up in the developing world. Places where it's going to matter the most in the future, like China, India, Brazil, Mexico, and so on, their meat demand is skyrocketing because hundreds of millions of people in those countries are thankfully escaping poverty. Now, of course, we want people to escape poverty, but when people escape poverty, one of the side effects is a much heavier footprint on the planet, including heavier meat consumption. And so when you consider the fact that we have 8 billion people today, hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of people who want to eat more meat than they currently do, and soon will be able to afford it. And then you consider the fact that according to demographers' projections, we're going to be adding another 2 billion people to the planet in the next 25 or so years. You're going to have 10 billion people on a planet that is not getting bigger. And as I said earlier, this is our only celestial body to farm. We're not going to be farming the moon. We're not going to be farming Mars. This is the only planet that we have in order to farm. And yet, we cannot just go deforest the rest of it simply to raise more and more animals. If we are going to satiate humanity's meat tooth, so to speak, if we're going to give humanity the food that it wants to enjoy, we're going to have to do it in a far more efficient way, which means producing the meat experience without animals. Think about it like this. Many technologies that we have today have displaced the use of animals in a way that is more efficient and that we prefer, but they still gave us a similar experience. Earlier, I was talking about quills and how metal fountain pens ended up allowing us to write more efficiently. Nobody stopped writing, right? We didn't stop using quills because people just stopped writing letters. We just found more efficient ways to write. First with metal fountain pens, and then ultimately all the way up to today by talking to glass screens. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to make sacrifices for meat, right? We don't have to give up the meat experience that humanity has evolved to crave. Rather, we can create that experience through microbial fungi fermentation that allows people to enjoy that same experience, but in a way that is far more efficient. Think about it kind of like photography. In the 1990s, we had companies like, let's say, Kodak and Canon that were vying for supremacy in the film market. And I remember in high school when we would go into a darkroom to develop our film. In fact, I remember when 1 Hour Photo came out in the late 90s, if my memory is correct, and I couldn't believe that I had lived long enough into this Jetsons-like future that we were getting our photos in only 1 hour. I was amazed. I could not believe it. And yet, of course, you fast forward to today and imagine that it took not an hour, but imagine it took 1 minute to get a photo. People would be outraged, absolutely livid, if you had to wait 1 minute to get a photo because we're accustomed to getting our photos instantly. Nobody stopped photos. Nobody stopped taking photos. Digital photos do the same thing for us. They allow us to capture our memories, right? Just like print photography did, but they do it in a far more efficient way that is better for us as consumers. And that's why you don't take your film into a darkroom anymore or to a store to develop it for you, but rather you take photos at will on your phone anytime that you want. Now, if you look at the companies that were involved in that, some of them prospered and some of them didn't. Kodak knew about digital photography. Yet it did not invest in the technology because it was afraid that it was going to cannibalize its core business of print photography and the chemicals that are used in darkrooms and so on. Whereas Canon thought this is going to cannibalize our core business, but we should do it because we believe it to be the future. And we all know what happened. Kodak went bankrupt and Canon became the largest manufacturer of digital cameras on the planet. The same thing happened in the video business, right? Blockbuster was dominant and they didn't want any competition for stores that were going to compete against them. And then Netflix began with a mail order DVD model. And that became much more convenient to mail order a DVD from Netflix than it did to buy from Blockbuster. And yet they both knew that streaming was going to come. They both knew that streaming was coming. And yet Blockbuster thought streaming could end up devastating its business model of having stores, these brick and mortar stores where people come to rent videos. Whereas Netflix thought this is going to cannibalize our mail order DVD model that our entire business is based on, yet they still did it. They still invested in streaming, and we all know what happened. Blockbuster went out of business, and Netflix is now the #1 streaming service. So, and the way we didn't stop watching videos. Again, we have the same experience of being able to watch a video like a movie or a TV show, but without the need to go to the store and hope they have the video that you want and so on. It's much more efficient. And the same is so with meat. Most people, when they eat meat, are not thinking to themselves, I'm so glad an animal was slaughtered for this. Rather, most people don't think about the fact that an animal was involved at all. They just want something that tastes good, is safe to eat, and maybe they're thinking a little bit about the nutrition that they're getting from it. It's kind of like when you walk into a room, you turn on the light. You probably don't give much thought to whether that light that you're getting in that room came from coal or wind or solar or geothermal or oil or something else, right? You just want the experience of an illuminated room. The same is so with meat. Most people just want something that tastes good, is safe to eat, and is nutritious. And so I believe that by harnessing the power of microbial fungi fermentation, that we can create that more efficient, more sustainable, more humane experience of meat consumption for people without having to use animals. And that this will be like digital film or like streaming video, that we will still continue the experience of enjoying meat consumption, but in a way that is dramatically more efficient. Just like metal fountain pens aren't mere quill mimicry, right? They are better than quills. I believe that divorcing meat production from animal slaughter not only can help slash our footprint on the planet, but it can create all types of novel culinary experiences that we have never before enjoyed. Think about, for example, cheese. Now, most people today consider cheese part of their daily diet in countries like the United States, but cheese is actually a pretty novel food. For the vast majority of human history, we didn't have cheese because it takes a lot to make cheese, right? First, you have to domesticate cows, then you got to start drinking their milk, then you got to figure out how to curdle milk, which requires rennet, which for a long time was only possible with calf intestines. So, you think about the time, let's say, after cows had been domesticated, but before anybody figured out how to make cheese, which is a period of a very long time. In that period, nobody had ever fantasized about brie, Gouda, cheddar, Swiss cheese, and so on, right? Like nobody had thought of them because nobody had ever experienced those foods. They are relatively novel foods on the history of humanity's timeline. But now many people consider them to be a staple of their diet and they don't want to live without them. Well, what new foods may we soon consider staples of our new diet when we start having new ways to make meat that are divorced from the need to raise and slaughter animals? What if, for example, just like you can currently go out and buy a bread maker or an ice cream maker for your kitchen counter, what if you could buy a meat maker? You just drop in a tea bag full of fungi spores and come back a few hours later to find freshly made meat? Or, what if, just like your local pub may brew their own IPA in the back, they could be brewing their own local artisanal fungi-based meat right on site for your dinner that evening. Even more, what if humanity does ever learn how to depart from our pale blue dot and explore the cosmos? You can rest assured that if we ever are engaged in cosmic tourism, we are not going to be carrying Noah's Ark in tow. If those cosmic tourists want to eat meat, they're going to need to grow it themselves. What better way than to bring microscopic spores of fungi and grow them with them, either on their space shuttles or on their new habitats on Mars or wherever they are going. I really think that this type of new technology may not only enable new novel culinary experiences like what I was just describing, but it may also shift a paradigm in our thinking about our relationship with our fellow creatures on this planet. Because for a very long time, our relationship with our fellow animals has been one that's based really, if we're honest with ourselves, on violence and domination. However, maybe it will become one that is based more on compassion and respect. We already know that folks like Copernicus and Galileo helped us to comprehend that we are not the centers of the physical universe. Well, maybe when we aren't so reliant on the exploitation of animals for food, we might come to think of ourselves as perhaps not the center of the moral universe either. That maybe the animals with whom we share this planet exist on this planet not merely for us, but they exist here with us. And that maybe we ought to view them as individuals who are deserving of compassion and respect, just like we think of ourselves. Now, that isn't to say that they are necessarily our moral equals, but it is to say that maybe we won't have a relationship that's just based on subjugating those creatures, and that we could create a new type of society that would be unthinkable to subject non-humans to the type of torment that we currently subject the animals who we raise for food. Now, it may seem unbelievable that that type of a world could exist after literally hundreds of thousands of years of human history of eating other animals. But, there's lots of things that seemed impossible that now seem common sense to us. Imagine, for example, just the fact that, let's say 150 years ago in the United States, the debate that was being had in our society was about whether humans ought to be able to own each other, right? For most of human history, it was considered normal and natural for humans to hold other humans in bondage. The Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, they all had slaves. Even Socrates and Plato, who were, the modern foundational thinkers of Western civilization, never thought in all of their philosophizing to criticize slavery. In the Bible, groups are enslaving each other all the time. And yet, 150 years ago, that was the legitimate social debate as to whether one person should be able to own another person. Thankfully, today, we know that that type of relationship is an abomination. We view it as ethically repugnant. Gratefully, we do. But 150 years ago, which was a blink of an eye, historically speaking, is a very different perception. You could hold a legitimate, respectable position in society as a member of Congress, a doctor, a lawyer, and so on, and hold either side of that debate, being pro or anti-slavery. 100 years ago, the legitimate debate in our society was whether more than half of the Americans ought to be able even to vote. We had a debate whether women should be able to vote. And it wasn't as easy as you think. There were a lot of women who were totally opposed to women's suffrage and thought that wasn't the appropriate place for women to be in the public sphere. Yet, of course, today, we think of any country that doesn't allow women to vote as being backward and archaic. And yet, 100 years ago, that was the United States legitimately having that debate. Just half a century ago, we were debating whether blacks and whites ought to be able to share the same water fountain. And yet today, of course, we would view anybody who believed in racial segregation as, really somebody you really wouldn't want to even be friends with. And yet there were many members of Congress and, again, respectable professions where people sat on both sides of the segregation debate. Now, of course, today, if anybody took the position that they supported slavery, or they thought women shouldn't be able to vote, or they thought the races ought to be physically segregated from one another, they would face social ruin for expressing a position that a blink of an eye ago, historically speaking, was a totally legitimate, respectable position to hold in our society. I'm very grateful that they no longer are respectable positions, but just imagine if one of your friends, not as a joke, not ironically, but seriously posted on social media that they supported any one of those, human bondage, the denial of suffrage to women, or so on. I mean, at best, they would lose their friends. They might lose their jobs. They would be a social pariah to hold any of those views. So it's so easy for us to think about how, of course, our ancestors were wrong about slavery. Of course, they were wrong about suffrage. Of course, they were wrong about segregation. But it's a lot harder for us to think about what we are wrong about and what our descendants may feel like, of course, we were wrong about. I believe that while there are many things that we probably are wrong about today that our descendants will condemn us for. The treatment of animals in factory farms is one of them. The idea that we should be able to lock up animals in cages so small that they can barely move an inch their entire lives, pump them full of antibiotics, make them live beak to beak by the tens of thousands inside windowless warehouses, and subject them to slaughter methods that most people don't even want to hear about, that is going to be viewed with more than a skeptical eye in the future. And I think that the technologies like microbial fungi fermentation are going to bring us to a place where it's easier for us to accept that that type of a treatment of non-humans is an abomination. Technology has changed so much about how we live here on Earth. Instead of whipping horses, we now use bikes and cars to get around. Nobody stopped whipping horses because they cared about horses. They stopped because superior methods of transportation were invented that allowed us to more efficiently get around. Instead of harpooning whales for their oil, we now use electricity. Nobody stopped harpooning whales because they cared about whales. They stopped because kerosene was invented, which was a cleaner, more efficient way to light our homes. And eventually we moved on to electricity, which was even better than kerosene. And whales were liberated from harpoons because of that new technology. And again, instead of ripping feathers out of geese's bodies, we now tap on screens. Nobody stopped harming geese because they cared about the geese. They stopped because fountain pens were invented. While these new technologies may at first seem odd to us, recall, for example, that what we now know as cars were originally called horseless carriages. We eventually come to realize just how superior the new technologies are. And we switch to them en masse, hardly recalling what life was once like before the new invention. Just imagine how shocked you would be today, for example, if someone you knew relied on horses for transportation, or they relied on whales for lighting, or geese for writing. Well, I believe that technologies like fungi fermentation will enable our descendants to also express shock if someone they know chooses to slaughter animals rather than use the obviously superior technology that humanity has invented. Fungi fermentation is just one way to help liberate humanity from our reliance on animal slaughter, but it is a critically important and, yes, scalable solution to this vexing issue of how we are going to sustainably feed ourselves into the 21st century. We only have one planet. We shouldn't deforest the rest of it just so we can eat more and more animals. Instead, just as we must end our dependence on fossil fuels, so too must we end our dependence on factory farms. Today, the only place you are likely to encounter a goose quill pen is inside of a museum. Similarly, it's time for us to leave the factory farming of animals where it too belongs, which is in our past. That is what we are working on at the Better Me Co., again, the company that I run, to try to create that type of new, humane, sustainable, efficient food production system that is less reliant on animals, that harnesses the power of the fungi kingdom and enables us to enjoy the foods that humanity loves, but with a much lighter footprint on the planet. So I want to say thank you to everybody who's joined this session. I see there are a number of comments in the chat, and so I'm going to take a look at those, but let me see if there's anything. Thank you, Dominique, so fascinating. I appreciate that. I'm going to start answering questions that are in here, but so you can put any questions in the chat that you would like, and just, chat away in there. So first,
Hey, Paul.
yes.
This Michael.
Hey,
So
Mike.
so thank you very much for that that great presentation. So actually, yeah, for the audience members, if you have any questions, if you're comfortable taking questions from the chat, you guys can put the questions in the chat. If you'd like to raise your hand,
Sure.
you can do so in Zoom. We'll post how to raise your hand in Zoom in the chat as well. So yeah, so great presentation, very interesting. So I've got some questions, and then we'll go to the audience and ask some questions. I'm going to ask you some questions about your presentation today with regard to the fermented fungi meat, as well as some of the clean meat stuff as well, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure. Sounds great. And
Okay.
it does look like there are a good there does look like there are a good number of comments in the chat already from people too. Are you going to be going through those or no?
Yeah, well, we can go through there
Okay.
and go down there as well.
Great.
Yeah, there was definitely
Thanks,
a
Michael.
lot of comments in there, and yeah, this is this is actually a very new subject, different than other topics that we have. So first of all, one of the, we're called the Real Truth About Health Conference. What is like the health profile for a product like this? Is this something, I would assume that it's going to be healthier than animal products, given all that we've learned during this conference about the dangers of eating animal products. But from a health perspective, how does this product look?
Sure. So if you think about what people actually like about meat, which is protein, iron, zinc, and so on, the mycoprotein that we grow at the Better Mico has all of that. In fact, it has more of it. If you think about the things that people don't like about meat, saturated fat, cholesterol, excess calories, so on, we don't have that. We don't have any of that. And so this is a product that gets you what you want from meat, but doesn't give you the things you don't want about meat. And one of the most important things to remember is that it's also packed with fiber. Meat has no fiber. There's not one piece of meat on the planet that has any fiber in it whatsoever. The reason is because animals don't have fiber in them. We have skeletons. Skeletons hold us up. Plants and fungi don't have skeletons. They have fiber. That's what holds them up. And while there's essentially no protein deficiency in America whatsoever, there is rampant fiber deficiency in America. More than 90% of Americans don't meet the meager fiber requirements of a daily allowance that the federal government sets. And other countries have even higher fiber requirements than what we have in the United States, but more than 90% of Americans don't even meet the US standard, which is a very low standard. The problem with fiber deficiency is not just things like constipation, which is a problem in and of itself, but colon cancer, heart disease, and other really horrible ailments that can be deadly that are associated with fiber deficiency. We need to eat more fiber. And if people aren't going to eat more fiber in the form, let's say, of bean and rice burritos and lentil soup, why not put it in the protein products that people were eating, in the meat products? And the benefit of using mycoprotein, like from the Better Meat Co., is that you get both. You get a bundle of high protein and high fiber all at one time. And the fiber is an intact whole fiber rich in beta glucans that are shown to be great for your microbiome. And so this is really almost like a superfood. Like if you were going to be going to Mars, this is what you'd want to have with you because it's got so much of what you need in it. So the nutrition on this is amazing. The taste is great. The texture is great. The environmental footprint is light. This is what we need to scale.
And does the fiber come from the mycelium itself, or is it something that's added to the product?
No. The mycelium is a single ingredient. It's not there's not some fiber added to it. This is a whole food intact product. The mycelium is the product. And so in the same way that, you might think about a portobello mushroom, right? But imagine instead of eating the portobello mushroom, you're eating the mycelium, which is the root-like structure of fungi. That product is what we at the Better Meat Co. sell.
Okay, and then you mentioned that you work with other businesses do they take this and then make this into a meat, or can people eat this product directly, throw it on the grill, and make a burger out of it without any further processing?
You might want to add fat to it because most people like a burger because it has some fat. There's this very low in fat, so unless you want a really lean burger, that would be how you would do it. However, we are a B2B ingredients company. We sell to other food companies. We are not seeking to become like the next Beyond Meat or the next Impossible Foods. What we want to do is sell to all of those companies. So they can use our mycelium to make the next generation of alternative meats that will be whole food, all natural, and absolutely delicious. So we currently run a pilot factory here in Sacramento, California, where we can produce thousands of pounds. We cannot produce millions of pounds, which is what's needed to actually go nationwide. So we're not our mycelium is not sold in Walmart and Costco and so on yet. We're currently fundraising in order to build a much larger factory so that we can scale this company and get to a place where we can actually produce for all of those companies. So if there's somebody listening, you're interested in owning a piece of the Better Meat Co., love to talk to you about that, how we can work together to scale this mycelium fermentation platform to create a much cleaner, more humane, more sustainable meat industry.
And are there products on the market that are using the mycelium meat that you guys provide?
Yes, we do sell to restaurants and they make like mycelium-based steaks and so on. That's largely in Northern California right now, only because of the scale that we're at. Again, we can't produce millions of pounds, which is what would be needed to go and and sell in the Walmarts of the world. But we're eager to get to that point. And Laura Slit, hello, I see you asked what the stock symbol is. It's a private company. We're not a publicly traded company, so these are our private shares that are sold. So the company is backed by a variety of food companies, venture capitalists, hedge funds, and so on. But we do accept investment from individual investors as well. But just get in touch with me via our website, which is bettermeat.co. Again, that's bettermeat.co. You can just message us through there if you're interested in owning a piece of the company. We'd be grateful to talk with you about that.
And as far as the other companies producing this stuff, is there anything that we could order now if we wanted to try it out? I personally would love to try a product. I'm sure many of our participants would love to try this out.
I would love for you to. If you're in Northern California, Michael, let me know. We'll point you to the right restaurants, where you can go get our steak. But we're in limited distribution right now only because of the scale of the company. So we are sadly not in a position to sell nationwide or internationally at this point with the mycelium, but we're working on it. So if you're in Northern California and you want to try the product, just get in touch again via bettermeat.co and we'll point you to the right places.
And are you planning on doing any sort of research on the health outcomes of people who move from meat to eating this product? Are you guys looking into that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done safety-based research to show that the product is perfectly safe to consume, which it absolutely is. But the next step for us is to look at what happens to people who actually do regularly consume this mycelium, because again, it's packed with beta glucans, protein, fiber, iron, zinc. It would be great for your microbiome. So it should be a real winner in that. But we haven't done those tests yet, but we would like to. Dominique in the chat asked, where can you see pictures of the products? You can see them at bettermeat.co. Again, bettermeat.co, or you can follow us on Instagram at bettermeatco, where you can see every day we're posting cool videos of the product. Beth, you mentioned Corn in the UK does something like this, and yeah, that's absolutely correct. Corn is a cool company. For decades, they've been making mycoprotein via fermentation. They own about 99% of the mycoprotein world in terms of market share right now. But what we do is different from them. So first of all, their product is, generally mixed with egg whites, and it has to have other processes like freezing and so on done to it to make it more meat-like as well. I don't find it to be identical to meat. I find it to be something that you may enjoy the taste of it. In fact, I like their vegan products. So most of their products are not vegan, some of them are, but I like the vegan ones. And I don't like them though because they taste like meat. I like them because I like the taste of them. It's kind of like if you like tofu. If you like tofu, you eat tofu not because you can't tell that it's different from meat. You like tofu because you like tofu and you want to eat it. The same is so with corn, Quorn, which is, it doesn't really taste like meat to me at least. So if you don't like it, as Beth is indicating that she doesn't, it's not because of mycoprotein, it's just because those particular products are that way. The other thing to remember is that mycoprotein is not mycoprotein, right? So there's lots of different species that you can grow of fungi proteins. And so in the same way that, let's say, think about all the species of animals who people eat, cows taste a lot different than chickens who taste a lot different from pigs. Well, and apples taste a lot different from corn, which tastes a lot different from wheat, even though they're all plants. And the same is true with fungi. Different fungi strains have different flavors, textures, protein contents, and more. And we at the Better Meat Co. use a very different organism than corn does, and we get a much more meat-like texture. And so that's a big difference between them and us, is that we are growing a different fungi protein than they do, one that frankly grows faster and is more meat-like in its texture. It also has a much longer history of human consumption for going back centuries than theirs, which has a history of human consumption going back decades. Theirs is perfectly safe to eat for nearly everybody, but it isn't the same as what we do. And I just want to point out to Maya, who's asking if it's a whole food, why is there a business making it? That's like, this is a fermentation process, right? You take fungi, you take spores, you subject them to a fermentation, and you grow them. in the same way that somebody might take spores of mushrooms and grow them inside of a mushroom farm, right? There are businesses that make and sell mushrooms, even though mushrooms are a whole food. Similarly, we're taking spores of fungi and subjecting them to a fermentation where we do grow them. And we grow them into foods that look and taste like animal-based meat. So that's how you get a business that goes into making these. And there's lots of different ways to make them, just like there's lots of different ways to brew alcohol. You can make beer, wine, etc. And there's a multitude of sub fractions within those of what type of beer, what type of wine, even though they're all just brewer's yeast essentially, which is fungal in nature, by the way. Brewer's yeast is a fungus. But think about all the things that you can do with brewer's yeast to make thousands of different types of alcohol. Well, with a different type of fungi, in this case, mycelial proteins, you can make all different types of cool products out of them. And so there's lots of business opportunities therein.
What's the fermentation process?
So imagine a stainless steel fermenter. It looks like a craft brewery, right? You fill it up with water, and then in that water, you're essentially going to put sugar, which is how you make beer as well. Like, when you think about the reason why you have the barley in the beer is because the brewer's yeast consumes the sugar and it converts it into alcohol, right? So when you make beer, you've basically got a microorganism that's consuming sugar and turning it into alcohol. Similarly, let's say you're making bread, you use baker's yeast. That organism consumes the sugar in the wheat and it converts it into CO2, which is why it makes the bread rise. In fact, when you see bubbles inside of the bread, that's from the CO2 from the baker's yeast. That's why if you don't have baker's yeast, the bread won't rise and you're going to get matzah for Passover rather than a loaf of bread. Now, we are not using organisms that when they eat sugar make alcohol or make CO2. What we're doing is growing organisms that are highly proteinaceous. And so they eat sugar, and then by the end of the fermentation process, which is usually about 16 hours or so, there's really no sugar left. They've consumed it, and now it's basically a package of protein and fiber. And so that's how we can make this so rapidly, because we are using these microscopic organisms. It takes a long time for a cow to make another cow. It takes a really long time for a pig to make another pig. But when you're doing at the microscopic level, that replication is really fast. It's happening, just happening, just happening. And so that's how we get a fermentation that can last only hours rather than having to spend months or years growing animals. Nancy, I want to point out, you're asking if you can tour the facility. Yeah, if you're in Sacramento, just hit us up. We're again, bettermeat.co. We'd love to hear from you. We do factory tours regularly. And I really appreciate, Dominique, your supportive words here. He says, first time you're hearing encouraging news with regards to the planet's future and the global transition to end animal exploitation. I agree with you. I agree with you. The key is to scale this up. It doesn't take that much money, but it does take money. We got to do it.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about your book on clean meat. Can you describe?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Michael. I just want to point out, Evelyn is asking, why does the website have a picture saying we start with corn, wheat, and potatoes? That's where you get the sugar. So, we don't typically use cane-based sugar. We typically use corn-based sugar or sugars from wheat or potatoes. So that's the answer to your question there.
So is this gluten-free, considering that it uses wheat?
The current process is totally gluten-free. We do not have any wheat in the final product at all.
Okay. All right. Great. And actually, so before I ask my other questions, so what is the health benefits of the product itself? Like when you think of mushrooms, they have certain health benefits. So this is, mycelium. If someone's just eat mycelium in general, what are the health benefits to adding that to your diet?
Well, you were going to get one of the benefits of mushrooms is their fiber content, which is very good, but also ergothioneine, which is is being shown. Ergothioneine is being shown to be highly beneficial in longevity research. And so essentially, people are finding that eating an ergothioneine-rich diet, which pretty much comes from mushrooms, you end up getting really big longevity benefits. However, you get a lot of ergothioneine and mycelium as well. So thankfully, this is not just the fruiting body of the mushroom, but the mycelium itself also is rich in ergothioneine. So in addition to protein, iron, zinc, fiber, beta-glucans, also add ergothioneine to that list. And you start seeing like this is really a superfood. It's really fantastic. And I want to just respond to, sorry if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but I'm going to say Yaping Tao saying, is this GMO? No, we don't use GMO technology at all. We're just growing an all natural organism. We're not modifying it in any way. Um, and then Tanya said you might need fat to be added. What are you suggesting? The question that Michael would pose was, can you make this into a burger? And I said, yes. I mean, normally burgers, though, are a fatty product. That's why they're so popular, right? They're made with what's called 80-20 beef typically, which is 80% protein, 20% fat. Our mycelium has way less fat than that, way, way, way less fat than that. So would it make a great burger? Probably if you added some fat to it, it would be tastier. But it's really good for a whole variety of purposes, even that are, much lower fat than a hamburger is. All right, Michael, sorry about that.
No, no worries. Actually, and is this organic? And not that it's labeled organic, but is this something that no, is there pesticides involved with regard to the corn or any of the, the sugar inputs as well as the mycelium itself and the process that you use?
Yeah, just to be clear, pesticides are used on organic produce and on non-organic produce. It's a complete myth that organic means no pesticides. If you buy organic corn, it was treated with pesticides, different pesticides, but still pesticides. So, the idea that organic is somehow pesticide free is totally mythological. When you use any agricultural, unless you're grown in your backyard probably, or very limited small scale agriculture, they're using pesticides. The organic program does not disallow pesticides. It allows pesticides, and it has no limits on how many pesticides can be used. The organic program allows for unlimited use of pesticides. It just restricts which type of pesticides you can use. Now, we buy a sugar that, is of course tested to make sure there's no residual pesticides from there on there. But that's not a concern for us. So, but because it wouldn't work it would not work in our fermentation. If we had pesticides in there, it'd be very bad for the growth of the organism. And so, we can make sure that we're getting product that is totally pure. And again, to Patricia, no, our product is non-GMO. Just want to address that just as that question was asked. And Yaping says organic is beyond just the chemical. Just to be clear, I'm not really here to talk about organic per se, but organic has various rules that do not disallow pesticides. They don't allow synthetic fertilizer, and as a result, they have to use nitrogen sources like animal blood, fish meal, bone meal, animal manure, and so on, as opposed to human-made nitrogen. And so there are differences. You're right. I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm just saying that there's often a myth surrounding organic that implies that it is somehow this, free from technology product, whereas just to be frank, it's just not true. Organic. I mean, I live near many of these massive, massive organic agricultural operations here in California. And it's, driving by, it's hard to tell the difference. I'm not saying it's not better than conventional. I'm just saying it's not pesticide free. The inputs can still, cause eutrophication, which is high amounts of nitrogen or phosphorus in the soil because they're applying lots of animal-based inputs on there.
All right, great. Thank you for that clarification. And let's see here. We actually just want to see one comment here. Okay, so regarding questions, so give me one split second. So in your book on clean meat, you talk about you argue that we can significantly reduce animal suffering. Can you share more about the ethical considerations that drive your work with regard to clean meat? And are you still doing that clean meats type of stuff that you talk about in your book, or are you focused now on the fungus, the fungi meat?
So I am an advocate for animal-free foods. I have been vegan for more than 30 years. The primary motivation for my decision to become vegan in 1993 was to prevent animal suffering. I thought about the fact that I wouldn't want my own dogs, who I considered my family members, to be treated in the way that we treat chickens and pigs and cows and turkeys. I remember watching a video on a VHS tape when I was like 13 years old that a friend showed me of animals having their throats cut in a slaughter plant. And I just thought, you know, I wouldn't want my own dogs to have that done to them. Why would I want to have that happen to any animal? And I knew that people like Einstein were vegetarian, but I didn't really think that he had much relevance to my life. But when I learned that Carl Lewis was a vegan, it really changed my view of things because I worshiped Carl Lewis. I have like a poster of him on my wall. For those of you who don't know who Carl Lewis is, he was like the top Olympian back in the 1990s. He was kind of like Usain Bolt or Michael Phelps today, and I really worshiped him. And so when I read an interview with Carl Lewis stating that not only was he a vegetarian, but he was actually a vegan and that he attributed a lot of his success as an athlete to his vegan diet, I thought, well, geez, not only is this more compassionate to animals, but the number one athlete in the world, as far as I was concerned, was also saying it was helpful for him athletically. And, I was pretty overweight as a kid, and I wanted to be a better athlete for a variety of reasons. And so when I became vegetarian, I then became vegan a few weeks later. Now, I didn't know what vegan was even. I mean, I had never even heard it, right? Like there was no internet back then. I thought it was vegan. And so I was like, oh, I'm a vegan. And then I, met these people who I learned were vegans, and I saw many of them and been doing it for a while. And I didn't really know that it was something that you could do long term. To be honest with you, I remember thinking at the time, it's probably like holding your breath, like I thought, you can hold your breath for a while, but if you hold your breath too long, you're going to die. And I thought, well, maybe you can, be one of these vegans for a certain amount of time, but if you do it too long, you'll probably die. And of course, then I started meeting these people again who I learned were vegans. And it became very clear to me that not only were they living for a long time, but that they appeared quite healthy and vigorous to me. And so I became one of them. And that was the real motivation for me, was primarily to prevent animal suffering. I thought if we don't have to kill other animals in order to survive, why do it? Now, if it was necessary for survival, I would have felt differently about it. But because we don't have to kill other animals for food, I thought, well, maybe I should just not do it and have a live and let live mentality. So that's what I did. And I'm very glad to have done it. And that motivates my thinking to this day. My wife is a vegan cookbook author. Her name is Toni Okamoto. You can check out her books or her website, plantbasedonabudget.com. So for me, this is a deep part of my personal identity, my family life, my professional life. My entire life is really devoted to trying to fix this vexing problem of how we're going to wean humanity off of an animal-based diet. So I am an advocate for anything that moves humans away from our addiction to using animals for food. I think that there are many ways to do that, just in the same way as I said earlier, that there's, wind energy, solar energy, geothermal energy. These are all ways to create energy without fossil fuels. Well, there's lots of ways to make meat without animals, which are, from plant-based meat to fungi-based meat to clean meat made from animal cells and so on. Now, there are some people who may say they don't want one or two or three of those, right? They may say, oh, I'm happy to eat plant-based meat, but I don't want clean meat. That's fine. Eat the plant-based meat. But I think there's a lot of people who want what they perceive as the so-called real thing, right? They want real actual animal meat. And they don't care if it comes from a slaughtered animal or from animal cells that were grown. And so for those people, I think clean meat, hopefully in the future, will be a good option for them. It's not an option today, but hopefully in the future, it will be. Maybe 10 years from now, we'll see. There's a joke about this. There's a joke about this field, which is that basically clean meat is 5 years away and it always will be. And so that, I hope that's not true. Somebody in a talk that I gave a few days ago said, well, maybe those 5 years aren't consecutive years. And then I was thinking, maybe they're not Earth years. I don't know. Maybe they're like Saturn years, which are a lot longer. I don't know. But I hope that one day that comes true. However, so I continue writing about it because I would like to, increase interest in the space. But for my own work, when I decided to start my own company 6 years ago, I did not decide to do animal cell culture because I just thought it's too far away. And the reason I pursued mycoprotein or fungi proteins instead is because I view it as a much nearer term way to try to drive some dent into the meat problem that has animated my life for the last 30 or so years. And so while I am enthusiastic about clean meat, I believe that other technologies are much nearer term to making a dent, and considering the urgency of the problem that we're trying to address here, that's how I'm focusing my time.
So now regarding clean meat, just because you wrote a book on it, so I'm going to ask you some more questions on it. Um,
Great.
what about the environmental footprint? There are some critics that say that that they argue that clean meat may not address all the environmental issues associated with traditional meat production. Is that a concern with clean meat, or does it have a better environmental footprint than traditional meat?
The environmental footprint is much better than conventional slaughter-based meat. It's not as good as eating lentil soup or bean and rice burritos. If people are willing to switch to those rather than meat, wonderful. We'll all be better off. But just in the same way that, it'd be better if people wanted to walk and bike more, people seem to really like to drive. And so it's important that we make cars that don't rely on fossil fuels. That's why we have EVs today, or even hybrid products, in this case of like a Prius or another hybrid car. And so, yes, it's way less land, way less water, and so on to grow animal cells than to grow whole animals, no doubt about it. But the problem is that it's really far away. It's just really far away. So yes, absolutely, it's better for the environment. It can't be bought today, but hopefully in the future it will be.
And just to clarify, so your company is called the Better Meat Company, correct?
That is correct.
Your book is called what?
Clean meat.
Clean meat. Okay. But their use of the meat is two different things. So clean meat is okay. I just wanted because when I was briefly looking at your
Think about it. Think about if somebody wrote a book about wind energy and then started a solar energy company. That's kind of like what it's like. You would guess that that guy is really interested in renewable energy. So
oh
that
no,
would
yeah,
be
I get it. I just wanted to make sure. So your company is not at all involved in what you're calling clean meat,
no, that's right. No, no, no,
and the
no.
meat here is all mycelium based.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I write about the clean meat industry, but I produce mycelium-based meat.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on are there any health benefits? Obviously a lot of this conference is dealing with the health benefits of a plant-based diet versus an animal-based diet, and I'm sure you're familiar with that to some extent, given your background. Are there health benefits for clean meat versus traditionally raised animals being used for meat?
Yes, absolutely. So think about it like this. Right now, if you have raw meat, you are warned to treat it almost like toxic waste, right? You go to the supermarket, you have to segregate it in your shopping cart. You can't touch your other foods. They bag it differently in a different bag. You bring it home. If raw meat touches your kitchen counter, you got to sanitize the counter. If raw meat touches your hands, you got to disinfect your hands. That's because there is feces on the meat. I don't mean that figuratively. I mean it literally. Salmonella, Campylobacter, E. coli, these are intestinal pathogens that can sicken us if we don't literally cook the crap out of the meat. That's what you do. You cook the crap out of the meat. Now, with clean meat, you don't need to worry so much about intestinal pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella because you're not growing intestines at all. You're just growing the meat, the muscle that you want. And so you're more likely to infect the meat with your hands than the meat is to infect you. And so nobody is going to say that eating clean meat is as good as eating a kale salad, but it is better than conventional slaughter-based meat. And so that is really one of the major benefits, this food safety benefit of not having to worry as much about intestinal pathogens, which are the most common pathogens that sicken us. Again, E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter, all the things that we associate with raw meat today, or with animal manure that gets put as a fertilizer onto organic vegetables, as an example. So all of that said, you can also make these meats have a different profile. You want to have a meat that instead of so much saturated fat has more omega-3 fatty acids. In theory, you could create that. So you have a hamburger in that case that maybe instead of causing heart attacks might actually prevent them. That is still more futuristic, but the benefits from a food safety perspective are evident and very clear today. Maybe in the future, they'll make clean meat that has a different health profile than conventional animal-based meat. Nobody would love to see the clean meat industry, though, rendered obsolete more than me. If people would just switch to eating beans and rice, be great. I'd be overjoyed. But sadly, the evidence for that has not been overwhelming so far.
Now, as far as you know, and I know that the clean meat industry is always 5 years away, but as far as heart disease, without them adding other antioxidants, is it essentially without all of the toxicity that comes from, dealing with real animals, like things like heart disease and stuff like that? Is there any, to your knowledge, is there any benefit with regard to it, causing less heart disease, or would we expect it to have very similar, TMAO and all these other things that come along with eating animal products? Would we expect that to still continue?
No, it could still be the same with cultivated meat, the meat that's grown from animal cells, but you could also imagine companies making it differently, right? So you could imagine instead of saturated fat, adding monounsaturated fat or even omega-3 fatty acids to it. That's not what they're doing today, though. And keep in mind, these companies they're in the R&D phase, they're not commercialized. But what they're seeking to do is at least benefit on the food safety side and hopefully to benefit on the cardiovascular side too. But it is real actual animal meat, right? In that particular case, you're not talking about something like a Beyond Burger, which is way healthier than a conventional slaughter-based burger, right? Again, no cholesterol, more fiber, less saturated fat, and so on. So I would not argue that these are necessarily the health foods that are currently on the market in some of these senses, like, again, lentils and brown rice and so on. But they are better, both from a health perspective and an environmental perspective, and obviously from an animal welfare perspective, than slaughter-based meat.
And what's the feedback on your mycelium based product? How does it? I realize that you have an ingredient that goes in, but are people? Does it taste just like meat? Does it have a texture just like meat? Like where's this at? And I'm annoyed that it's in California. No offense to California, but I'm in New York.
Yeah, I certainly hope that we will be in New York in the near future. That said, yes, it really does taste like meat. I mean, I'm not just saying that. We run focus groups regularly there where people will try it and say that they think it tastes like meat. And I have another test that I do that I call the Eddie test. It's better than any focus group for me. Eddie is my dog, and he is very finicky. He doesn't like plant-based foods. He doesn't like fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, beans, none of it. He doesn't like plant-based meat, won't eat Beyond Burgers. However, when I give him a better Meatco mycelium-based steak, he devours it. He absolutely loves it. So I use that as the, single dog test, the Eddie test, to make sure that these products really can be attractive to meat consumers like Eddie. Now, we're not basing it all on Eddie. We do our own focus groups and so on. But the short answer is yes, it really does taste like meat. And, the reality is that people love meat. Now, of course, many vegans say, oh, I don't need meat. That's fine. But, we vegans are a tiny portion of the population. Most people want meat. In fact, I was giving a talk at a Veg Fest. Now, keep in mind, a Veg Fest is, a place where people go to eat vegetarian food, right? Like you go to a Veg Fest to get vegetarian food. And it was almost like a cartoon. They had two booths right next to each other. One was literally selling quinoa wraps, right? And directly next to it, they were selling Beyond Burgers. There was not one person in line for the quinoa wrap. And the Beyond Burger line probably had more than 100 people in it. It was unbelievable to me. And it was just a good example that even people who go to a Veg Fest want meat. We can't get around it. I wish we were different. I'd be thrilled if that was not the case. I would rather people be different. I'd rather human nature be different. But yeah, as Dominique pointed out in the chat right now, a lot of ethical vegans are fond of plant-based meats. I didn't stop eating meat because I didn't like the taste of it. I stopped because I was concerned about the ethics of doing so and the harm that it did to animals. But the reality is that most people do seem to really like to have meat. In fact, sadly, the surveys of vegetarians show that 84% of people who become vegetarian stop being vegetarian. That's pretty bad rate, pretty bad recidivism rate. So the key is how do we create meat without animals so that people can enjoy that experience that humans do seem to want to crave, but without animals. And I think mycelium is a really fantastic way to do it.
All right, I'm gonna throw it out to the audience to ask a few questions. We have Joe L. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
Yeah, hi, I'm in New York. How are you?
Hey,
And
Joe.
I like a lot of what you're saying. Really sounds great. I went
You can
online and
you can stop there, Joe. That no, just kidding. Just kidding. Go on.
and I did see, and I kind of understand where you're going with this, with Hormel and with Purdue, which is great. I guess my concern is that it should be a bottom up movement too. I know you're going top down with it, and that's great. I get it. But how difficult is it for you guys to take all the resources you have and allocate a very small percentage of it to the bottom up? People like me and Michael that want this stuff, we're listening to you, and we're waiting for Hormel to do something. It ain't going to happen with guys like us. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, Joe, I'm very eager to hear your ideas of what you think we should do. So I'm attracted to what you're saying, which is bottom up. But what does that look like specifically to you?
Specifically, it looks like there are whole food. I'm sorry, there are health food store distributors. In a nanosecond, you can probably get 1,000 of them to get your products in a split second. Based on what you're saying, I am so convinced of what you have is better than anything on the market. Okay, I listened to you the other night on the panel, and I hear you now. I went on your website. I'm a farmer, and I know what mycelium is, and I see the importance of it. I see the importance of fermentation. All that stuff is good positive bacteria in the body. So you're definitely onto something, and I like that you want to change the world. But again, I think that the low hanging fruit of health food stores, that's easy stuff. You don't need venture capital for that. You guys can sell that tomorrow to them. I think they'll buy it very quickly from you. So that to me is my answer.
I appreciate that, Joe. It's good advice. It's good counsel, and I appreciate it. And I can assure you that I take it seriously.
So, so a question somewhat along that line is, you're talking about selling the mycelium meat to businesses to then make into a product. Is the product that you're selling this ingredient, could a cook just add stuff to it and make it into something viable, or does it need extra processing to be made into something kind of like a pea protein? You wouldn't just like throw that into, into your stew and there's your meat, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't do that with pea protein because it's this isolate. It's not a whole food. But in our case, as a whole food, you really can do what you were just, excuse me, what you were just saying, Michael. So that means that you could take strips of this and just put in a stir fry and you have like basically chicken. You'd want to flavor it because the mycelium doesn't really taste like much. It has the meat-like texture, but the flavor is very mild. It's like an umami type flavor, but it doesn't really have a deep flavor in it. So you'd want to season it in such a way that would give it whatever flavor you were trying to impart into it. But you could do what you're saying, which is add it as an ingredient in a further processed product. But you can also just use it as a single ingredient whole food that you add as the protein portion of whatever meal you're making.
Okay, well, if you start shipping, I'll buy some and add it as an ingredient to go
Very
along
good.
with.
I had it last night. I made I made a stir fry last night that was basically yam leaves, which is pretty cool. You go to like an Asian supermarket, you can buy yam leaves, so like dark leafy greens, but they're from the yam, from like the sweet potato. It was stir fried yam leaves, red onion, shiitake mushrooms, and then a lot of strips of mycoprotein from our facility here. And I seasoned it basically with like an Asian seasoning, and it was so good. It was really amazing. It was a great dish.
So do you plan to be selling direct to consumers so they can buy the ingredient and make it themselves? Because like,
Yeah,
kind of like Joe was saying, I think if that's the case, I think that you would have an audience, but I'll leave that up to you. I'm sure you've looked into this stuff.
it's not our business model. Our motto is really B2B ingredient. We want to we're specialists in fermentation. We're not specialists in branding and marketing and so on. There's a lot of companies that are doing that. We'd love to sell to them.
Great. Our next question is coming from Evelyn C. Please state where you're from and ask your question.
I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico. So, I'd like to talk more about the low-fat nature of your product because I know you say you're selling it in restaurants, but are those restaurants doing anything? Are they adding anything to make it more fatty? Because most U.S. restaurant consumers love fat. They love the taste of fat. And even the commercially successful products like the corn, they're adding all kinds of stuff. They're adding egg whites, they're adding wheat and Impossible burgers, and they're adding coconut oil, they're adding canola oil to make it palatable to the consumers. And so when you talk about Hormel maybe licensing your product or your technology, I'm afraid that what they're going to do is they're going to take the mycelium and then they're going to, just like corn, they're going to add a bunch of junk to it to make it palatable to the plant-based quote unquote consumers, because as we all know, a lot of plant-based consumers aren't health conscious.
Sure, yeah. So I agree with what you're saying, Evelyn, that there are many people who eat plant-based meats not because they're trying to improve their health, or that may be a side effect that they view it as, but they're trying to lower their footprint on the planet. They're trying to prevent animal cruelty and so on. And for them, maybe eating an Impossible Burger that it doesn't have animals in it, but is maybe not as good as eating lentil soup again. For them, that satiates that desire. But then there's other people, like evidently you, who are eating plant-based in part because you really care about your health and you want to improve your health. And so that's why I think it's so important to have a base ingredient that companies can sell for consumers who want to do what they want with it. Where you can buy a bag of mycelium and use it in any way that you want. If you want to add something to it, you can. If you want to do what I did last night, which is I didn't add anything aside from seasoning to it. And it was a salt-free seasoning too. So this was a, virtually zero sodium meal here. And I didn't add any fat to it. I didn't cook it in oil even. I just stir fried it in like a nonstick pan and it was great. So you can do that. And I do care about my health. It's not my primary motivation. Again, animal welfare is what really drives me. But I do care about my health, especially as I get older. I'm in my mid-40s now, and I would hopefully, like to think that my life is maybe only half over, as opposed to being 2/3 over. So I increasingly care about my health, and that's one reason why I try to do things like limit sodium and limit saturated fat and so on. So I'm one of those consumers you're talking about who really likes to have products that are lower in saturated fat and lower in sodium for the very reasons that you're noting here.
And with regards to the mycelium, how do you are you growing that yourselves, or do you buy it and then like you're just the fermenter, so you're not involved in the farming process?
There is no farming, there is no farming process for the mycelium. So basically, if you think about like a sourdough culture, if you're making sourdough bread, you have a culture. You take half of it, you make your bread, and you put the other half in the fridge. And it regrows, and you just keep using it. And you can use it for decades or even centuries. The same is so once you have your original mycelial spores, you don't ever have to go back and harvest or farm or anything to get those spores. You have them forever. And so, yes, we did wild harvest our spores years ago, but we just use the same ones over and over and over again and let them regrow. So there isn't some place that we're buying mycelium spores from. We just have them in our freezer.
All right, great.
And I want to just mention to Pammy, I agree with you that we are animals, and I care about the welfare of humans just like you do, including myself. So I'm totally with you, Pammy. And while animal welfare is what really drove me into this space, I certainly would be elated if we could also reduce heart disease, type 2 diabetes, various cancers, all these problems that we know are associated with a diet that's heavy in animal products. So that to me is a very real benefit that I definitely care about as well.
And given your background in clean meats, as well as the mycelium-based meat, what do you see the future is as far as the acceptability to the larger population? Do you see people adopting this stuff in greater numbers? Do you see that is increasing? Is that going up, or is it going to be a long time before we see the general population looking toward these products as a viable alternative to traditional meat?
Well, people are already eating plant-based meat and fungi-based meats a lot. So, Corn, the company we've been talking about in the UK, QUORN, they're selling several $100 million of product every single year. In fact, I was in London last year and I saw a sign outside of a KFC that advertised they were using corn. And I went in and looked at it, and the corn patty was basically nearly the same price as a chicken patty. It was pretty impressive. So, obviously, people in London are quite happy to eat fungi-derived products if the KFC consumer is going in and buying them. Now, and the same is so if you go to Burger King in the United States, they all have Impossible Whoppers now, so somebody's buying those, right? With clean meat, we don't know yet. It's not on the market. We know that surveys show that a good number of people, not everybody, but a good number of people say that they would be happy to eat it. But you don't need everybody to eat it. You don't need everybody. Even if we could have a reduction in 25% of the animals who are used for food, that would spare billions of animals from factory farming. You could rewild millions of acres of deforested land that was used for crop production to feed all those cows, or that was used for pasture for cows. And so while the evidence is suggestive that people are happy to eat clean meat, it's not everybody, but it's a good number of people. The problem is that even plant-based meat and fungi-derived meats today, despite the fact that they're a multi-billion-dollar industry, are a minimal rounding error when it comes to the total meat industry. The global meat industry is worth about $1.5 trillion. The global plant-based meat industry is only single-digit billions of dollars. So, the plant-based meat industry today is not even 1%. Not even 1% of the total meat industry. Even if you look at just the United States, where the plant-based meat industry is the most mature, even here in the United States, plant-based meat is not 1%. It's not 1%. And so there's this question, is it going to be like organic, which has really not grown that much, right? Organic is still well less than 5% of the total food industry. Is it going to be like that, where decades later it's still a minimal portion of the food industry? Or is it going to grow into something that becomes more mainstream? Where it's going to be, something that might be 20, 30, 40%. It's kind of like electric cars. 10 years ago, they were at 0% of the market, essentially. And now it's single-digit percentages, and it's presumed that electric cars are going to be the future. Already in places where I live, like California, it's going to be illegal by 2035 to even sell new cars that have internal combustion engines. Automakers like GM say that in the future, they're going to stop making internal combustion engine cars. And so you kind of see how electric cars are going to go from a rounding error in the vehicle industry to becoming the norm, and maybe even the only option eventually within decades. And so my hope is that plant-based meat is going to be like that it won't remain like organic, which for decades has remained essentially a rounding error in the total food industry, whereas it'll be more like electric cars, and that it'll become the norm. But we'll see.
And what challenges have you seen or do you expect from traditional animal agriculture? Obviously, to the extent that this could displace those products on the market, there's going to be an aggressive pushback. Have you seen that? And what are the expectations? And to the extent that you've seen it, how is that presented itself?
Yeah, unfortunately, you're absolutely right, Michael. I wish that you were wrong, but you are right. And that is that whenever there's an incumbent industry that is threatened by a new innovator, they're going to fight back on it. And so that has manifested itself in a variety of ways. And this is not new. Even in the 19th century, the dairy industry was crusading against margarine, what they called oleomargarine at the time, because margarine was cheaper than butter. And so the dairy industry fought to pass laws in the 19th century that taxed margarine to make it more expensive than butter. Some states even passed laws requiring margarine to be dyed pink, so that not only would it look repulsive, but it meant that nobody would confuse it for actual butter. And now we don't have those laws anymore, but we have laws that are similar to that. You have a number of states that are looking at legislation right now that would restrict how you can market these products. So whether you can call them meat, like plant-based meat, right? So can you call it a plant-based burger if it doesn't have actual cow meat in it? Similarly, there are fights about whether you can call things plant-based eggs. There's a popular product called Just Egg that's made out of mung beans. And it says right on the front of the package, made from plants, not chickens. But there's a question, from the egg industry, they're going to say, oh, this isn't, they're confusing consumers. And then Tanya is pointing out that there's still a fight over the term milk today. Like question, can you call it soy milk or oat milk or almond milk or so on? And in Europe, they've actually banned a lot of these terms. Now, does it matter? I mean, I don't know. Like, the most popular brand is Silk. They don't use the term milk, right? They just call it Silk. They don't say it's soy milk. They say Silk. Or Oatly, right? Oatly doesn't say this is oat milk. They just call it Oatly. And does that matter to the consumer? I don't know. I don't know whether it matters or not, whether what it's called. But certainly the meat, egg, and dairy industries, or at least some people in them, do care, and they're trying to pass laws to crack down on how these products are marketed. Similarly, when it comes to clean meat or real meat grown from animal cells, there's also a real problem because you now have states that are looking not just to restrict the marketing of them, but to ban their sale altogether. So the Florida legislature just about 2 weeks ago passed a law. Governor DeSantis has not yet signed it, but he indicates his support for it. Hopefully he'll change his mind. But in Florida, they have now, the legislature at least, has passed a law that would make it a criminal act merely to sell cultivated meat. And the sponsor of the bill explicitly said that he was doing it because he wanted to protect the cattle industry. So you have some critics of the clean meat space who are, maybe some people even who are listening to this right now who would say, oh, I don't like it because I don't think I don't like technology and food or whatever. But you have other critics who are with the meat industry who say they don't like it because they think it poses a threat to the factory farming of animals and they're trying to ban it. And so you have real legislative offenses that are going on right now to attempt to kill this nascent industry while still in the cradle. And it's not just Florida. In Tennessee, there's a bill right now that's pending in the state legislature that would not only make it a crime to sell meat grown from animal cells, but would fine you $1 million if you are convicted of it. Now, keep in mind, in Tennessee, armed robbery carries a maximum fine of $50,000. So imagine if this bill were to become law, you could go rob somebody with a gun in Tennessee and only pay a $50,000 fine. But if you sell cultivated meat, you get charged $1 million. So, this is the type of kind of wacko world that we live in when you see industries getting threatened by new types of innovators. And it's imperative that anybody who wants to see this industry thrive, that wants to see this industry actually be able to make a dent and build a more sustainable food system that's less reliant on animals, that we fight back against these bills, that we can create the lobbying efforts needed if you live in Florida or Tennessee, for example, to make sure that your lawmakers know that you oppose these types of ill-conceived bills. And Laura mentions the EATS Act, which is another offense. It's not so much about the marketing of alternative meat products, but it would ban states from regulating animal welfare practices of the products that are sold within their state. So where I live in California, we have a law that says if you want to sell eggs or pork in the state, they can't come from animals who are locked in cages where they couldn't move their whole lives. The Supreme Court ruled that that was constitutional, but there's now a bill pending in Congress called the EATS Act, which would be designed to basically federally nullify those types of laws. California is not the only state that's done it. Numerous other states have done it too. But there is a big battle, the public policy level at the state and federal level, over meat-based foods right now, both from an animal welfare perspective and just the alternative proteins perspective too.
And just a small question: is there any way to tell the difference between grown meat versus regular meat, and what would if not, how would you stop the companies saying, oh yeah, this is grown meat, but it's really just the animal agriculture packaging it and labeling it?
Well, the price would be one way because it costs a lot more to grow the meat than to raise an animal right now. So there's a very steep price increase. So it would be tough to see how anybody could sell it at price parity with conventional meat right now. But yeah, this would be an issue, is how do you tell the difference? And I don't have a good answer for this right now, Michael. I think that as these companies get closer to mainstream commercialization, they're going to have some way to do that. And I think that it will be scientifically possible to do because it's not going to be totally identical to slaughter-based meat. Maybe one way would be to see what the fecal pathogen load is on the meat. And if it's high, then it's an indication that it's not actually clean meat, that this is slaughter-based meat. But this is a good question. This raises interesting questions about what will happen in the future. And I don't know the answer to that.
Great. So we're going to wrap up. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
I just want to say thank you. You're taking your time out of your schedule to try to make your life and the world a better place. And I really appreciate all that you're doing to build a better food system. The most important thing that we can do is build a food system that's less reliant on animals. That will help whether you're concerned about health, whether you're concerned about the environment, whether you're concerned about animal welfare, and more. Reducing our reliance on animals for food is the most pressing thing that we can do to build a better food system. And I am enthusiastic about a variety of ways to do that, whether it's just eating more plants or eating plant-based meat, fungi-derived meats, or in the future, even cultivated meats. But right now, we have to find ways to wean ourselves off of this addiction to the factory farming of animals. And I'm grateful to every one of you who is working toward that end. I'd love to hear from you. Please feel free to contact me. My website is bettermeat.co. Again, bettermeat.co. You can contact me through there. I'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in reading my book, it's called Clean Meat: How Growing Meat Without Animals Will Revolutionize Dinner and the World. As I mentioned earlier, there's a new updated paperback edition that actually came out just today. You can buy that on Amazon or anywhere the books are sold. Or if you want to learn more about the book, go to cleanmeat.com. Again, cleanmeat.com. And if you're interested in investing in this space, I'd love to hear from you as well. So please contact me. I'll give you my direct email address, which is paul.shapiro@bettermeat.co. Again, paul.shapiro@bettermeat.co. Please get in touch with me. I'd love to hear from you and love to work with you to build a better food system together.
And what was the name of your wife's cookbook?
She's published 4 cookbooks, but the most popular one is called Plant-Based on a Budget. So check that out. Plant-Based on a Budget by Tony Okamoto.
All right, great. Thank you so much. If we could unmute the audience so they can share their appreciation for Paul.
Yeah, my money's worth.
Oh, bravo. Thank you.
That's
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And you could add one to
Mira,
slide.
estoy revisando aquí lo que me